Hello, and welcome to A Life with Culture. I'm St. John Flynn. I recently produced a virtual program for the Young Texas Artists Music Competition that in part asked the question, what is classical music? To begin to answer that question, I talked with Brett Mitchell, music director of the Colorado Symphony. Mitchell is perhaps one of the greatest fans of the music of John Williams, and he regularly performs both Williams's film scores and his concert music with the orchestra. I asked him about the place of film music in the concert hall and what draws him to John Williams's iconic film music. Brett Mitchell, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You have been music director of the Colorado Symphony for 4 years now. And before that, you were the associate conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra, and you were at the Houston Symphony for 4 or 5 years. So you know your way around an orchestra and a concert hall. And I want to ask you a question. I don't know if this is a question that you get asked a lot, but what is classical music?
It's a great question, So I think there are a couple of things that we can mean by classical music, and this is one of the issues that we run into. There is kind of this overarching genre that we have that we call classical music, but we're not entirely sure what the boundaries of that are. But there is also, within classical music, within this whole enormous genre that encompasses centuries and centuries of music, there's also what we refer to as, completely unhelpfully, the classical era. And when you think of people like Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, early Beethoven in particular, you're thinking about the classical era in music. So sometimes we're thinking of the classical era, but what is classical music? I would say that classical music is any music that has been written down on paper, like that has been actively written down with a greater or lesser degree of specificity of exactly how the composer intends for the performers to try to execute the music. In other words, it's music that is based upon an exact notation, as opposed to something like jazz or pop music, which tends to be based just more on, you have the tune and you have the harmony, but the harmony can be played by it could be played by the guitars, could be played by the keyboard, could be played by anybody and everybody. It's not proscribed by the creator of the piece in a way that the cadenza in the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is always played by the oboe because Beethoven wrote it for the oboe. So I think it really has to do with the exactness of the notation and how specific a composer intends for his or her players to execute what's in front of them.
I know that you have a particular love of film music, and we are recording this interview on February 8th, which is a special day for you. That looks like you're twins. You're wearing the black roll neck.
You're a very kind gentleman to let me out what February 8th is. Yes, today is John Williams's 89th birthday. Wow. If you can believe that. And it's I have been an enormous John Williams fan my whole life because of when I was born and where I was born. I'm sure I was born in the late 70s in America, in Seattle. And so I was growing up with, Superman and Star Wars and E.T. and Jaws and all the rest. And so, while I'm an orchestral conductor now, the first orchestral music that I heard growing up was not like the Mahler symphonies that I conduct today. It wasn't in a concert hall. It was coming out of the speakers in our living room or in a movie theater or wherever else. The first orchestral music that I ever really heard, and if you want to, this gets back to your previous question, if you want to call it classical music, because it is very exactly notated, the first classical music that I ever heard were film scores. And I think for a lot of people, my age in particular, I think that there is just less of a distinction than there used to be between, like, we put our Mahler and our Strauss over here, and we put our John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith and Alan Silvestri over here. And not that I'm trying to necessarily qualitatively, compare those two groups. But I think that because of when I grew up and because of the films in particular that I was growing up with, the idea that I would, there were weeks at the Colorado Symphony, back when we used to be able to have 100 people on stage and 2,500 people in the hall. There were weeks in a row where I would do, like right before the pandemic started about a year ago, I did 3 weeks in a row with the orchestra. And this is a very kind of Brett Mitchell set of 3 weeks. The first week was Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. Last year was Beethoven's 250th birthday. So it was wonderful to get together with the Colorado Symphony Chorus and the Colorado Symphony and to do this great monumental masterpiece, Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. The following week, the orchestra and I did a live to picture performance of John Williams' score for Return of the Jedi. And then the week after that, we did the big piece on the program was Richard Strauss Heldenleben. I don't remember what else was on that. Oh, it was a Christopher Theophanides concerto for 7 percussionists and orchestra. But my point in telling you all of that, and all of that, by the way, I would consider classical music. My point in telling you all of that is that I think what used to be perceived as this is the classical music and we put it in this box, and then this is the film music and we'll just open that box whenever we need to open it and dip in, and the cash cow that is film music. And I don't think that it's like that as much anymore, and I think some of that is just the test of time. But look at what John Williams did right before the pandemic started. John Williams went to Vienna for the first time in his entire life at the invitation of the Vienna Philharmonic to do an entire concert of his film music with the Vienna Philharmonic. If the Vienna Philharmonic can play Jurassic Park and Hook and Jaws, I think that we need to all open our minds a little bit more about what classical music actually is, because this is, there was an old ad campaign when I was growing up. This is not your father's Oldsmobile. This is not your grandfather's Oldsmobile. This is not your grandfather's orchestra anymore. It's right. It's just not like that anymore.
So what is the overlap between the music that John Williams writes for movies and the classical tradition? Because he's a very classical composer in some respects, isn't he?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, all music has a lot in common because there's only 12 notes, right? I'm sitting at the piano. Those are the only 12 notes that they are, and then we just repeat them over and over again. So John's music comes from a lot of places. I mean, one of the other things I must say that I'm very happy about is that we have gotten away from calling John Williams, derivative. Oh, this is the Rite of Spring, and this is the planets, and yes, of course. And should we all remember what Brahms encountered when he, loosed his first symphony upon the world? One of the critics said, well, it just sounds like Beethoven's 10th symphony. And Brahms's direct quote was, any ass can see that. Like, yes, that's what I was trying to do. Thanks. You've successfully landed on it. So I think, John's music is so based in, of course, previous film music, the Korngolds of the world, the Steiners of the world. But that really comes from the opera tradition. I mean, if you really want to go back to if you think about a score like Star Wars, for example, I won't use the main theme. I'll use what we call the Force theme. It's a leitmotif. It's a simple, short little idea that conveys a concept every time you hear it. So this is the Force theme. so that's the Force theme. Every time that appears, something to do with the Force. Leia has a theme. Yoda has a theme. So there are all of these themes that John uses to tie what ended up being 9 films in the Star Wars saga together. It's a wonderful idea and absolutely not John Williams's.
Right.
That idea really comes from a number of places, but it really comes from Richard Wagner, the 19th century German opera composer. In terms of, this is really quite something. The Ring cycle is about, which is a cycle of 4 operas that Wagner wrote on this old Ring legend. They're about 15 hours of music or so. Mm-hmm. John Williams now, with this last installment of the Star Wars saga, Episode 9, has written more music for Star Wars than Wagner wrote for The Ring. So think about that for a second. But my point is, in The Ring, that was where Wagner really developed this leitmotif idea kind of to its fullest extent. So yes. You have one of the heroes is Siegfried, or from the last 2 or 3 operas, and he has a... So, and it's this very, very short, instantly recognizable musical ideas that we can attribute to an idea or a person. And that's, John took that straight from Wagner, as did all of the film composers before him.
Do you have a favorite John Williams score?
My usual answer for that is Empire Strikes Back, which is the second of the Star Wars films, Episode 5, but the second one that was made, the whole drill. This was back in 1980, and the reason that I love it as much as I do is kind of the same reason that I love the movie as much as I do, which is in Star Wars, you get to meet all of these different characters. You get to meet Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and Han Solo and Chewbacca and all the R2-D2 and 3PO and all these different characters. And with them, you're meeting all of their musical companions, their musical leitmotifs, the things that go with those people. We are being introduced to those people. It is, by its very nature, as the first chapter in this saga, expository. The second chapter, we don't need to be introduced to these people anymore. We don't need to be introduced to these musical themes anymore. Now, we can just play with them. We can just play with them over and over again and put them together in different ways. So I love Empire for that reason. I'll also say, there are cues there's one cue in particular in Return of the Jedi that I find very effective, and it's called Yoda's scene. Because he's only in one scene in Return of the Jedi. He dies at the end of the scene. If that's a spoiler, you have had 38 years, so I'm not interested in your letters. But no, it's a lovely scene. It's just Mark Hamill playing Luke Skywalker and Frank Oz doing the puppet as Yoda. But it's so incredibly meaningful. And because you've now had Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, and now we're on our 3rd iteration of the film, all John Williams does for the 5 minutes that it takes us to say goodbye to Yoda is just one leitmotif after another. When we're talking about this, we're hearing about this. When we're talking about that, we're hearing about that. And to me, that's the kind of thing. While I love his score for Superman, while I love his score for Jurassic Park, while I love desperately his score for E.T., those are one-off films. And you can only, yes, Jurassic Park had sequels, but these are really kind of one-off ideas as compared to something like Star Wars or Indiana Jones, where you get to play with that for however many years you get to score those films. Right. Anyway, yeah, fantastic stuff though.
How do the members of the orchestra respond to playing film scores?
It's funny. When I started doing film scores maybe a dozen years ago when I was at the Houston Symphony. I think that the big obstacle that I thought that I was going to encounter on the podium, not because it was the Houston Symphony, but because it's any orchestra, was just resistance to the project itself. Just resistance to like playing film music. Like, this is not what I signed up to do. I honestly, I have not experienced ever anywhere doing those projects. Maybe it's because of the projects that I choose to do, which is frankly almost exclusively John Williams. But the big reaction that I get now is, these scores were recorded over weeks and weeks at a time. Nobody ever intended for people to sit there and play. Like in Return of the Jedi, which I told you was one of the last things I did with the Colorado Symphony before the pandemic began. The Colorado Symphony, you break up these films into, 2 acts so that the orchestra can have a break. But the last hour of Return of the Jedi is wall-to-wall music. There's no break for the orchestra. It's an hour of just nonstop playing. And this is not, like, row, row, row your boat gently down the street. It's incredibly challenging music. It is incredibly virtuosic music.
Yeah.
So the thing that I actually hear from the players more than anything is like, this is a lot of music. It is incredibly taxing. It is very challenging. And so that really helps to kind of inform like how I rehearse, making sure that I'm not overdoing things, because I told you I did the Beethoven Missa Solemnis, Return of the Jedi, and then Heldenleben. And I had people coming up to me during the Heldenleben week saying, Heldenleben has never felt so easy after doing Return of the Jedi last week. It's like, if you could get to a place where playing Heldenleben feels like, oh, thank God we're at Heldenleben, it's really, really quite something.
What about the reaction of audiences in the concert hall to film music? I would imagine that some people are really, really happy and love it, and some people might have it might give them a pause. Do you find that there's much prejudice against it on the part of the audience?
Less and less, I think. I will say that, so much of the film music that I do now, because I've been a music director, I don't tend to do as many, Pops concerts as I used to. But I do a lot of complete performances of films with scores, or I used to when we were allowed to do things like that. And the audience is, it tends to be, well, let me say this. I have done It's a Wonderful Life, and I have done Back to the Future. Those are very different audiences that come to those projects. Mm-hmm. You don't get a lot of the kind of like, the crowd that comes to Jurassic Park is exactly the crowd that you think comes to Jurassic Park. It's not mostly 65-year-olds that are coming to Jurassic Park. But it is mostly 65-year-olds that are coming to things like It's a Wonderful Life or Amadeus, for example. So I think that, the nice thing about film music is that it's such a wide world that even within it, again, one of the last projects, no, I guess this was a year before that, but I also did Amadeus here at the Colorado Symphony, which is nothing but music of Mozart and a couple like little pieces of Salieri here and there, which Salieri would have loved. But like, listen, if you can't get behind coming to a performance of Amadeus where the film score is entirely Mozart, right. That's kind of as classical as it gets. So I think that the world is wide enough of film music that everybody can find something that they're interested in.
John Williams has also written a certain amount of what we might call concert music. Music for orchestras to play in the concert hall. It's not a score to a film. Have you conducted any of those pieces?
I have. I've been very, very fortunate to do that. I've done a number of his shorter pieces. When I was at the Houston Symphony, he had written a fanfare for the Houston Symphony. called something, and I can't remember what it is now. You know, the man's written like a dozen fanfares at least. So,
Right.
but I was able to conduct that, which was great because we had the parts for that in our Houston Symphony Library. But and I've done that with a number of other kind of little things as we've gone through. But one of the things that I really wanted to do when I got here to the Colorado Symphony was to highlight exactly what you're talking about, which is this is not just the film score guy. He writes stuff for the concert hall as well.
Right.
And one of the pieces, probably the biggest piece that outside of concertos, which he writes a lot of, one of the maybe the biggest piece that he's written in the last, 30 years, maybe 30 or 40 years, I guess, just a pure orchestral piece, was the piece that he wrote for the opening of Walt Disney Concert Hall almost 20 years ago now, a piece he wrote called Soundings that was premiered by the Los Angeles Philharmonic. The LA Phil did the premiere when they opened the hall. Dudamel conducted, I think. Is that right? Who can remember? And then they did it. Now maybe John conducted the premiere, but then they did it again. LA did it one more time on like a little tour or something like that. But that was the only time the piece had ever been done. And the piece is called Soundings. Perfect idea for a new concert hall, kind of stationing players all over the place and working with electronics and all the rest. So when I got to the Colorado Symphony, I really wanted to put together a John Williams concert on his birthday. So I guess this was 3 or 4 years ago today. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to feature some of his concert music. And so our wonderful team at the Colorado Symphony reached out to John Williams's people and said, listen, I know this piece has only ever been performed by the Los Angeles Philharmonic, but is there any way that we could get our hands on this? And with a number of caveats and qualifications, including we had to bring out Randy Kerber, who is like the session player, piano player for everything that ever happened. Any piano solo you've heard for the last 40 years is Randy Kerber. And Randy works with John Williams, and the synthesizer stuff had to be... So anyway, I mention all of that because it was quite an... It was quite an involved process to try to make that happen, but completely understandably so. I mean, this is a kind of an experimental piece, and John Williams has a pretty famous name, and I'm sure is not interested in one of his concert pieces being played and not going well. So we were able to do Soundings, and then he wrote this other, just quickly, he wrote this other wonderful piece for the turn of the millennium. Steven Spielberg had put together this project, like a 25-minute film called An American Journey. And it was like narrated by Bill Clinton and all of this stuff live. And John Williams wrote the music for it, because it's Steven Spielberg, and conducted it live. I have loved that music forever. It is just not in print, except it is in print. It's just been sitting in proofs and edits for, I don't know, 20 years or what the problem was. But we were able to do a few movements of that piece as well on that program. So I'm very fortunate to have been able to do some of those concert pieces, which are fantastic.
I saw John Williams conduct an entire program of his own music with the Houston Symphony, including the cello concerto that he wrote for Yo-Yo Ma, and Yo-Yo Ma was the soloist. It was that was quite spectacular, you know.
I have to tell you, when my first season here, we had Yo-Yo with us, and we did the Dvorak concerto, which was wonderful, of course. But I remember a little bit of it. But I'll tell you what I really remember from that night was the encore that we did, because we did the elegy that John Williams wrote for Yo-Yo. And it was like one of the most beautiful, heartbreaking moments of my entire life, sharing that with Yo-Yo. That's just, that's another genius, but neither here nor there.
Well, look, Brett, I really appreciate you giving us these insights into the concert hall, and particularly the music of John Williams, which seems so at home now on the stands of the orchestra members. Happy birthday to John Williams, and Brett Mitchell, thank you very much.
Thank you, St. John. My pleasure.
May the force be with you.
And also with you.
Thank you again to Brett Mitchell for sharing his thoughts on film music on the orchestra stand, and thank you also to Young Texas Artists for permission to share this interview. And thank you to you for joining me. For more from the world of arts and culture, please like and subscribe, and join me again next time. I'm St. John Flynn, and this is A Life with Culture.